Hi, friends. Over the last couple of days, we've been thinking about worship. The sacraments are an important part of our worship and of our spiritual life and faith. A sacrament is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Think for a moment about what a sign does. A sign points to something beyond itself. For example, a stop sign doesn't intend to bring attention to itself, but it intends to point to the intersection ahead and bring your attention to that. A deer crossing sign, you're not supposed to pay attention to the sign, but you're supposed to pay attention to the deer who are crossing the road. So a sign points to something beyond itself. The two sacraments in the United Methodist Church are communion and baptism. The sign of baptism is water. The signs of communion are the loaf and the cup. And the thing to which those signs point is God's grace, God's unconditional, unmerited, unlimited love in Jesus. Now, a few days ago, we thought about God's grace and the ways that we know it in three different forms. You might remember I used the analogy of a sweater. Prevenient grace is God's love in Jesus that is at work in our life before we are ever aware of it. Justifying grace is God's love in Jesus that becomes active in our life when we do become aware of it and when we accept God's love in Jesus into our heart and into our life. Sanctifying grace is God's love in Jesus that works throughout our whole life long, continuously making us more and more like Jesus. So prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace are all ways that we experience God's unmerited, unconditional, unlimited love in Jesus. When it comes to communion, there are three names that we typically use to describe it. And each name focuses our attention on a different aspect of the celebration. Holy Communion helps us to focus on the community that we have with Christ and with each other. We all come together around the same table, and we are all united with Christ, with each other, and with our brothers and sisters around the world who share in this sacrament. The Lord's Supper helps us to remember the Last Supper that Jesus shared with his disciples. And we focus on the sacrifice that Christ made on our behalf on the cross. When we call communion the Eucharist, we're focusing on thanksgiving. Eucharist is a Greek word that means thanksgiving. And so the Eucharist helps us to remember to be thankful for Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, the things that he taught us, and the way that he showed us to live. What qualities and characteristics of bread and wine make them good signs for God's grace? Well, bread nourishes our body, just as God's grace, God's love in Jesus, feeds and nourishes our soul. Wine lifts our spirits, just as God's grace, God's love in Jesus, lifts our spirits, not only so that we can live a happier, more joyful life, but also so that we can ultimately be lifted into God's glory. Bread and wine are normal, everyday things. And it reminds us that God's love is part of our normal, everyday life. Not just our church life, not just when we're good, but all the time God's love is with us. In the United Methodist Church and in many other denominations, we use grape juice instead of wine. Historically, that goes back to the time of Prohibition and temperance. The United Methodist Church was very active in removing the ill effects of alcohol from families. That practice continues today out of consideration for those who might be dealing with addiction. We wouldn't want anyone to feel excluded from the table of grace because they felt like they couldn't take a sip of wine. Speaking of including everyone at the table, the United Methodist Church and other denominations practice open communion. And that means you don't have to be a member of the local church or the denomination in order to partake. As you know, there are several ways to receive communion. And by the way, we always talk about receiving communion, not taking it, because communion, God's grace in Jesus, is a gift. So one of the ways we receive communion is by intinction, and that's where you have a piece of the bread and dip it into the cup. You can also receive communion by coming to the altar rail and kneeling or standing, and an individual piece of bread and an individual cup is brought to you. Usually when that happens, the person who's receiving it cups their hands together, kind of like a manger, to receive Jesus into their hands and into their heart. Of course, nowadays we have the prepackaged elements too, out of concern for communicable diseases. In some traditions, every person drinks from the same cup. And in some traditions, only the bread is shared and the cup is not. Because we believe that the bread and the cup are signs of Jesus' real presence with us, anything that is left over is either consumed or returned to the elements. So we don't ever throw it away in the trash. We either consume it or we take it outside and return it to the earth. In our tradition, you don't have to be a certain age to receive communion. Again, because of prevenient grace, we trust that God's love is working. And so even if a child doesn't understand it, God's love is working in that moment. So those are just some thoughts and considerations about Holy Communion. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to Pastor Bob or me. Next time, we will consider the sacrament of Holy Baptism. Until then, have a great day, and I'll see you soon.